result is in our hands, and the result depends on the grace of the God. We invite Sri Vivek Subramaniam to lead a prayer to the Almighty.
धवलावगुण्ठनवती तेजोमयी नैष्टिः स्निग्धां पाङ्गविलोगिनी भगवती मन्दस्मितश्रीमुखी वात्सल्यामृतवर्षिणीं सुमधुरम् संकीर्तनालापिनी श्यामांगी मधुसिक्तसूक्तिम् अमृतानन्दात्मिकामीश्वरी अमृतानन्दात्मिकामीश्वरी अमृतानन्दात्मिका ईश्वरी.
Thank you, Vivek ji. Ayodh proudly invites our leader, Brahmachari Amit ji, to offer the welcome address.
Very warm welcome to all of you here. If you don't mind, can you reduce the volume? Before we start, may I request the final 10 participants, if they are here, just stand wherever they are. I have heard your names, but I just want to see all of you once. And everybody. Now, before we begin, I would like to first welcome our chief guest of the day, Sri Arvind.
Thank you. Sri Aravindan Neelakandan. He is a great thinker and an eminent writer, and most of you probably know him for his wonderful work with Sri Rajiv Malhotra. He has co-authored the book Breaking India. I would strongly recommend that you read that book. It's a wonderful book. He's also a contributing editor at Swarajya magazine and at tamilhindu.com. We welcome you all. Our hearty welcome to you, sir. I would also like to briefly welcome Dr. Prakash Shankaran. He was one of the judges, and he obtained his PhD in virology from Czech Republic. Thank you for coming here. And then our very own dear Rameshwar Shivdasji. He was also one of the judges. Can you just stand up for a moment? He teaches at our MBA college. Thank you. So my dear friends, I'm sure some of you have this question lingering in your mind. What is the purpose of this 4M4I? That's a short form of 4 minutes for India. What is the intention? And the purpose of this contest is hidden in the name itself. I'm reminded of a great saying, which I'm sure many of you have heard. And if you have heard, just complete it with me. Sow, S-O-W. Sow a thought. Reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. And sow a character, reap a destiny. So it all starts from one thought. And that is why they say thought is the most powerful thing in this universe. It is true. It is the most powerful thing in this universe. Everything you do, it all starts from one single thought. And my dear friends, we all know Amma, our most beloved Amma. She is not just a great spiritual leader. She is also a world-renowned humanitarian leader. Because she strongly believes that Vedanta, or the highest truths, are not only for talking, they are also to be really inculcated in our day-to-day life. Many of you would have heard this phrase. There are too many people who talk the walk, but there are very rare who walk the talk. So at Ayudh, our effort is to create individuals, bring together those individuals who can walk the talk. And these 10 finalists who have come here, we thank you all for taking your time and effort, because you have really walked the talk. And I'm not excluding others who are sitting here, by the way. So many youth we know, throughout India we know, except few. There are many who go around unbothered, unpatriotic about India. But we must realize that our mother, our Bharat Mata, needs us more than ever. And from Ayudh India, this was our humble effort to come up with such a contest, not just to give away prizes, but also to foster an environment where we at least give a little thought to our mother, to our Bharat. Because we realize that thought is not something trivial. Every great action starts from a thought. So we called upon the youth all across India to come up with this 4 minutes of video, 4 minutes of idea for our country. And we received a lot of entries. And at Ayudh India, especially Amritapuri chapter, they have taken a lot of effort going through these entries, shortlisting them, organizing this event. And I guess I would be partial if I didn't mention few of their names. I'm sure the list is very big. But briefly, I would like to mention few names who are here, and I will request them to just stand up for a moment if they are here. Amritesh, just be there. I knew you were going to go out. Many of them want to keep a very low profile, so they're very shy. So just bear with them. Ashish, Hari Krishnan, Rupesh, Shivanandan, Ramesh. There are a few other names, and I know they are not here right now because they are doing something very important. So anyway, those of you who have come here, we really thank you, because we know that it is not for money or for the prize you have come here. It is for your passion for India. And I was told that today morning, the final round, the whole shortlisting, after that, the final 10 people went through another very, very strenuous round where our 3 judges were also present. It was supposed to be a 1-hour job, but it took them 4 hours, because the kind of passion these people showed while presenting and the equal amount of passion shown by our judges, it was very, very inspiring for all of us. So I'm very happy that you have taken so much effort in doing all this and bringing it to this level, this conclusion. I would like to briefly tell you, what is Ayudh in a very, very brief way, and what is its vision. what Amma has foreseen for us. You know, Ayud stands for Amrita Yuva Dharma Dhara. Amma's vision was that the youth of today should be able to perpetuate the wheel of Dharma, be it natural harmony, social justice, and personal empowerment. And at Ayud India, this is our vision, and this is the kind of environment we are trying to foster, wherein youth can come together and bring in this Dharma into our current society, into our nation. And you will be happy to know that from these final 10 entries, we will be using some of these ideas in Amma's various humanitarian projects throughout India. So that is something I think I really feel very, very happy when I heard that. And it's a great moment for all of us, for all the finalists who have come here. I'm sure when you go from here, when are you leaving today? Tonight? Tonight. I'm sure you will leave with something very, very precious. It won't be the prize money, it won't be the certificate. Of course, that is also precious. But more than that, I believe it will be the love for our nation, and especially the bond you are fostering with Ayud India. That is something very precious you will take with us. And I am hopeful that all 10 of you will be our Ayud members in future. Yes? Yes? Sure? What about the people in the front? Yes? Okay, very good. If you watch little carefully, when I saw this graphic over here, it seemed very amusing, because the guy who has the first prize, his both hands are up. The guy who has the second prize, his only one hand is up. The guy has a third prize, his both hands are down. Should it be like that? How should it be? How should it be? Both hands should be up, because it is not whether you have won the contest or not. That is not important. It is that you have taken the effort to put forth that idea, to take that effort and bring it to this level. All of you are winners here. Not even one of you, please don't go away thinking that, oh, we lost the contest. All of you are winners. But, we cannot give 10 prizes. So we have a limit, so we are just giving 3 prizes, okay? So with that, I would once again welcome all of you, and let's enjoy the rest of the evening. I think we have a wonderful talk by our chief guest. Thank you once again. Om Amriteshwari Namah.
Thank you, Amit ji. We invite our honored chief guest, Sri Arvindan Neelakandan, to enlighten us with words of wisdom. Sir, please.
My pronounce to everyone who has been here. And essentially, I am not a waiter, so I don't know whether I will be able to. What I am going to do is essentially share some of my thoughts with you. That's all. It is about Indic knowledge system. Whenever we talk about Indic knowledge systems or any ancient knowledge system, there are some problems. One is that people start telling we had everything in our past. We know everything. We don't have to learn anything. We know everything in the past. And then there is this, that everything came from us. Nobody had any original idea. Actually, everything came from us. There may be some truth. There may be some exaggerations in all these claims. However, the ultimate question is how it is going to help us right now. How it is going to help us experience our present and shape our future. Actually, the approach that we are taking here is all knowledge that you see around us, whether it is the Western science or whether it is the Western technology. Whether it is the Western technology or the science, they all have embedded value systems. They have their own, what we call, epistemological framework. Epistemology is the search for knowledge. You create philosophical tools, philosophical frameworks to attain knowledge. These frameworks and tools will decide what type of knowledge that you acquire. So, if you take the Western tradition, if you take the mathematical tradition, it starts most probably with Pythagoras. And from Pythagoras you go to Plato and Aristotle, and then from Aristotle the Christian theology comes, and the Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy, they form some kind of a monolith, and the entire Western science till the 19th century was resting on this monolith. Now in the case of India, if you see, we have here what we can call epistemological pluralism, because we have here 6 darshanas. Apart from these 6 darshanas, you also have the Buddhist approach to reality and the Jain approach to reality, and all of these have been harmonized into the creation of Indic knowledge systems. So now we are going to see how we can actually approach our ancient knowledge system and use it the present day problems. And it is really interesting that some of the real achievements of the Western science, or I would say the modern science, it has been influenced by Indic knowledge systems. It is not that we know all these things already, but that the Indic knowledge system has been able to provide the correct framework and tools to understand knowledge. I will start with an example. I am not very comfortable with this. Can you change the slides and say? Can you just change the slides? Yeah, thank you. So here you have a poster. I come from Tamil Nadu. In 1960s, the end of 1960s, the US astronauts landed on moon. 1970s, there was, within a single inverted comma, a rationalist propaganda rally. And they had this particular poster in that. They wanted to tell the people that the God that you are worshipping is having moon on his head, and on this moon, the American astronauts have landed. So you people are all just superstitious, silly barbarians. See what United States has achieved. So this is one of the posters that was made in 1970s by the so-called rationalists. I would call them pseudo-rationalists. So this was the poster. Now what is the problem with this poster is that it takes a fundamentalist, literal view of Nataraja. Nataraja is the divinity as the dancer, as the cosmic dancer. Even an ordinary Indian child can know that. An ordinary Indian child will know that it is not somebody who is dancing there with 4 hands and moon on the head. The child will know that it is symbolic. At the same time, it represents a deeper reality. But the curse of India is that we have got the so-called rationalists who take fundamentalist view of religion. In every other countries, the fundamentalist will take the fundamentalist view of religion. The believers will take the fundamentalist view of religion. The rationalists will take the poetic or symbolic view of religion. And there will be clash. In India, it is the so-called rationalists who take the fundamentalist view of religion. So you have this. Now we'll go to the next slide. Just after that, here you have 3 instances of Nataraja being looked at by different domains of knowledge. The first one you see is the cover picture of book on thermodynamics. It was written by a Nobel laureate, Ilya Prigogine. he was talking about how chemical systems which are not in equilibrium, they become creative. They create spontaneous structures. These structures are called dissipative structures, and the modern evolutionists will tell you that these dissipative structures are the basis of the very phenomenon called life. So they are very important both for chemistry as well as biochemistry. So at the molecular level, he sees a dynamism and he wants a metaphor for that. And what is that metaphor he uses? It is Nataraja. The next whom you have is Fritjof Capra's famous Tao of Physics. He is a particle scientist, a particle physicist. He is looking at the microcosm, the basic subatomic particles. The way the entire subatomic particle is a web of dance, and he visualizes Nataraja in that, and he made this photograph. Remember, this does not mean that my subatomic particles are traveling in the form of Nataraja. That is nonsense. Essentially, it is the subatomic particles, the world of subatomic particles, the universe of subatomic particles is in a dynamic movement, and this movement is the creative process that underlies the very reality. And the metaphor that he uses is that of Nataraja. Then you have another person, Carl Sagan, who is actually a cosmologist. Now, this person, a very famous cosmologist, astrophysicist, he created a documentary called Cosmos. He wanted to explain the basic cosmological principles, how the universe comes into being and then it goes back into its subtle form and again it expands back, kind of an oscillating universe. And he uses again the image of Nataraja as a kind of what he says the premonition of the modern cosmological theories. So now you have three scientists in three different domains, one at the molecular level, another at the subatomic particle level, another at the cosmic level. And they all can see in their domains of knowledge, if they wanted to have a metaphor to explain the aesthetics as well as the science of their knowledge, their field, they are using Nataraja. Is it just a coincidence that our ancestors have created such an image for our own contemplation and meditation? So this is exactly what we want to do again. What we want to do is we want to take our own knowledge frameworks, frame our own questions and explore the mysteries of the universe. Do science, do technology based on our own frameworks. We cannot have the Aristotelian framework, and that is what has happened, that is what has gone very wrong with our system. There is a beautiful book called Physics and Philosophy by Werner Heisenberg, that he actually explains what right now, what today, the particle physicists, what the quantum mechanics, the people who are advocating quantum mechanics are debating is essentially the same question that the Greek philosophers were debating some 2000 years ago. It will be really interesting to see in the Western tradition, you take a PhD student in physics, he would be definitely knowing about Heraclitus, he would be knowing about Neoplatonism, he will be knowing about Aristotle. You take an Indian student of physics, it will be very rare if you find a person who knows about Kannada, who knows about the Vaiseshika principles of matter, who knows about the Sankhya. There will be one George Sudarshan. Of course, George Sudarshan says that if you look at the Dalton's model of atoms, which in turn is derived from Democritus, from the Greek tradition, and if you compare it with our own concept of atoms, you find that the atoms that our ancestors envisioned provides a better framework to understand the modern concepts of atoms. George Sudarshan says this. So you have a George Sudarshan, you have one V.S. Ramachandran in the field of neurology. There are isolated examples who know both the modern science and also our philosophical traditions. But if you have such a person, those persons can actually create. So if we have a curriculum that integrates the questions of science with our ancient philosophical frameworks. I am not talking about religion. I am talking about our ancient darshanas. They are not even philosophies. Again, the language is a real hurdle. We always fall into the framework of the persons who create the language. And hence we tell philosophy. It is not philosophy. The darshanas, if we actually have a framework that integrates the questions of science today with our darshanas, then we will be able to create a very creative, productive science students. Now what is the situation today is India produces the largest number of science graduates, and India stands, let us say, at the bottom of global innovation index. Even a communist China is able to do better, because despite the fact that China is a communist state, after a particular period of time, they started integrating their traditional systems with modern science. So there is nobody there who will question actually the state running a Shaolin temple, a state running an acupuncture centers. In fact, they see acupuncture and Kung Fu and Taoism and Confucianism as ambassadors taking their culture to West. It is a very interesting and a paradoxical situation. If you see a Westerner taking Chinese studies, within a period of time you will find that when he graduates and comes out in Chinese studies, he will start defending Chinese occupation of Tibet. At the same time, if you see a Westerner taking Indological studies, he goes into Indological studies as a lover of India. When he comes out, he will start telling India is occupying Kashmir. He will become an Indo-phobic person. So this is actually what happens when your frameworks are not correct, because you study Indology through the Western framework. You study Chinese studies through Chinese framework, not even Marxist framework. You study Chinese through Chinese framework. So that is the importance of the frameworks, the knowledge systems, and we should know how to use them properly. There is no advantage in telling that Pythagoras came to India and learned his Pythagorean theorem from here. That is not actually the thing about which we should talk. We don't actually know whether really Pythagoras came here or not. There are writings in Pythagoras, there are writings of Pythagoras which show remarkable Indic influence, true. But whether actually Pythagoras came here or not, we really do not know. It is in the domain of we do not know. But even before Pythagoras, in Salpa Sutras, the Pythagorean theorem has been stated in India. That we can claim, yes. So all we can say is it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, but we cannot still say very correctly it is a duck, because we are not in a position to assert globally. So we have to go to that particular position. The entire presentation, the aim of the entire presentation is that. Here I am taking one specific problem in modern science that happened from, let us say, 1930s to recently. So, what is life? That is this question. What is life? The West frames the question two ways. Either life is a vital principle. You have a body which is a machine, and life is nothing but ghost in the machine. So life is a vital principle. So against this there is another stand. No, life is nothing but a particular complexity of matter. Once matter attains a specific complexity, specific critical mass in complexity, then the phenomenon of life emerges. This is called life is an emergent property. So either life is an emergent property of underlying matter, or it is a ghost in the machine. So these are the two frameworks they formed, and they have been debating about it. They have been trying to study what is life through these questions. Then go to the next slide. Based on that, they created experiments to study the origin of life. The famous Urey-Giller experiment. This is the Urey-Giller experiment, where what they wanted to do was circulate the basic chemicals, subjected to the same conditions that ancient earth experienced, and then they were able to obtain basic organic molecules. Then they postulated that from prebiotic molecules came the DNA, and from the DNA came the proteins and then the life. So this is exactly the kind of picture that you can get, the kind of framework that you can create and you can analyze. If you are going to frame your questions based on these two opposing binaries, that is emergent life and one is the emergent life and one is the emergent property, another is the vital principle. If you are going to frame your questions based on that framework, then this is the maximum point to which you can go. But there was also another one set of people who were trying to ask the same questions. They were essentially the quantum mechanics was at that time emerging. A field called new physics was emerging. The theoretical physicists of that time, the best theoretical physicists of that time, they were asking these questions. And there were two persons who were asking these questions very importantly, which had a very great influence on the entire course of science. Go to the next slide. So this is the Indic view of life. In Indic view of life, it transcends the binary and it is essentially consciousness based. So it is consciousness based means naturally it is cognition based. We will come to that later and we'll go to the next slide. So these are the two scientists who talked about the origin, who looked into the problem of the origin of life. One is Niels Bohr. So Niels Bohr gave a lecture. Interestingly, it was on August 15th, 1932. So he gave this lecture called Light and Life. He said, either you can look at a living organism as a jumble of molecules, as a collection of molecules, or you can look at the living organism as life. So if you look at a living organism as just a collection of molecules, you will miss the aspect of life. If you look at the organism as a whole, as a life form, then you will not be able to study just the collection of how the collection of molecules work. So now persons in you who have already studied physics, you will know essentially this is derived from the idea of quantum mechanics. Either you can identify a particular particle's place, or you can identify the particular particle's velocity, speed. You cannot identify both. It is the uncertainty principle. Now, what actually Niels Bohr was doing was that he was applying the insight that he got in physics to biology. And he is telling the biologists, remember this, he is telling the biologists, do not go for a reductionism, but go and create a framework out of box from the insights that we have got from physics. Niels Bohr had a very brilliant student, John Archibald Wheeler. He is one of the best physicists of his generation. He was a student of Niels Bohr and he points out a very interesting thing. He says, Archibald Wheeler says that Niels Bohr was very much interested in Upanishads. Whenever he wanted to frame questions in science, remember, he was not seeking answers. Whenever he wanted to frame questions in science, he would go to the Upanishads and study them. And he came out with a complementarity principle. The complementarity principle is that you have a particle that is both particle and a wave. Both are diametrically opposite characteristics, but they are not against each other. They complement each other. What he said was, this should be the same for all phenomena in the world. Whether it is life or whether it is human relations, you should be able to, whether it is sociology or whether it is biology, you should be able to apply this. So, he delivered this lecture. This lecture became a very big hit with the theoretical biologists who are working on the problem of what is life. And then it was taken up by Erwin Schrödinger. Erwin Schrödinger again is a very famous physicist. Those among you who have studied, who like popular science books, who have studied Schrödinger's cat by John Gribbins. Schrödinger's cat is a mythical cat. It was not his pet. There is a box into which there is a cat, and in the box there is also a vial of poison, and a quantum phenomenon will decide whether that particular poison vial will be broken or not. So when you look into that particular box containing the cat, it will turn out to be either the cat is alive or the cat is dead. But when you are not looking at that particular box, the quantum mechanics theory demands that the cat will be simultaneously alive and dead. Actually, it is something that you cannot conceive very easily. The cat will be simultaneously alive and dead. Schrodinger was very much interested in Vedanta. He was a student of Vedanta. In his lecture, What is Life, which was later published as a book, he said that some kind of continuity should be there. The life form, the mechanisms or the process of life should simultaneously hold itself together. At the same time, it should also change. So it should be having exactly two opposite qualities contained in them. And he said that this should be common for all life. And he arrived at the famous Mahavakya in the Upanishad, Tattvamasi. He said, you should have this feeling that all life is one. Despite the variety and the diversity, all life is one. If you have that frame, then you will be able to look for the mechanism, the process that unites everything. And that later, based on the work of Erwin Schrodinger, the Francis and Crick both were influenced by work of Erwin Schrodinger. They arrived at the DNA's double helical structure and the whole story we all know after that. So, in the very fundamental basis of a modern discovery, you have an Indic knowledge framework. This is very important. You'll go to the next slide now. So now, the most recent definition of life is said by two immunologists, Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana. They belong to Brazil, and their view of life is considered as the cutting edge view of life in science. They say that life at its very base, essentially what is life? It is cognition. Whether a particular organism, so far the West has always associated cognition with the brain. An organism should have brain. Organism should have nervous system. Then only it will be capable of cognition. But these people said no, at the very fundamental basis, at the very fundamental level, whether it is a single cell organism or whether it is a cell organelle, when it defines itself and when it distinguishes itself from the surrounding, and it creates some kind of communication with the externalities, with the external surroundings through the biochemical language, then the concept of self gets created, the I gets created, and then the cognition starts. And it is this cognition, it is not reproduction, it is not preservation, it is this cognition which is the basis of what life is. Now again, it will be interesting to know that Varela was actually a student of Buddhist meditation, and this particular aspect, that cognition is the basis of life, you can see it in Kenopanishad. Say, Pratibodha Viditam. Every pulsation of cognition is consciousness itself. So from there, you have this present day definition of what is life. So now you see the importance of, you should be able to see the importance of having a philosophy, a Darshana based science education, a Darshana based science curriculum. It helps you to appreciate science, to understand science, to explore science. It is not just exploring science, also to understand and appreciate science also you need that. I'll give you an example. When people believed once upon a time that God created the world, they wanted to look into each and every life form to see what mechanisms God has put into those life forms. So it gave birth to a particular branch of philosophy called natural theology. So natural theology based scientists, they always look see clockworks. How the designer, the super designer, the supreme designer has put these clockworks into the organisms. Then came Darwin, and Darwin proved that there is no design actually. As Richard Dawkins famously said, it is the work of blind watchmaker. So once this concept of blind watchmaker comes, that the entire biological evolution is not actually a designed one, but it is a random dance of the biological dice, then the natural theology becomes a hindrance. And you should understand this very clearly. First, it was actually a tool for knowledge. What was actually the tool for knowledge? It just became a hindrance for knowledge. Because they were adhering to only one stream of theology and philosophy. The advantage that India has is that it has the Sankhya philosophy. You have this evolution, and the evolution does not necessitate a creator. No problem. That is what we have in Sankhya. We can say that Niriswara Sankhya-vada is that. So, you see that at another level of evolution, the cause is actually, the effect is actually embedded in the cause, and cause is embedded in the effect. Well, we have that. It will be very tough for a person to understand it if he has come in the Aristotelian framework. For us, it will be very easy because that is Satkaryavada. Even as a child, you are told that the curd is already there in the milk. So you know, if somebody says that the effect and cause are circularly connected, they are not connected in a linear way, they are connected in a non-linear way. For an Indian child, it is very easy to understand. For a child also, it is easy to understand. But what we have done is, we have created an artificial divide. We have created an artificial divide that we learn all these things, or we don't have even an opportunity to learn all these things. Whereas in the school curriculum, you are taught science only through the examples of Western views. So you have the apple of Newton always falling down, and Newton wondering about gravity. So whenever you start your classification of animals and plants, you start with Aristotle and you end with Linnaeus. And it will be really interesting for you to know that the Linnaeus classification of plants actually borrowed that particular system from Kerala. Most of you may be knowing that. The Kerala Ayurvedic system of classification of plants actually contributed to the Linnaeus system of classification. At least 200 plants in Linnaeus system of classification have been classified according to the Kerala system of classification. Or rather say, the Indic Ayurvedic system of classification. So, we have these frameworks. Now, we go to the next one. Yes. Now we come to Darwin. So what exactly did Darwin achieve? We should know to appreciate how these knowledge systems work. We all have seen this picture of evolution. If you go to Google and if you type in the Google images evolution, you will have this small monkey, then the big monkey, then the gorilla, and then there is the human being, usually a white male. You will always see that. From the monkey, it will end with a white male. It is a progressive linear evolution. Actually, Darwin didn't propose that. This idea of evolution, this linear idea of evolution was already there in the Western concept. Right from the day of Aristotle, it is called the great chain of being. The great chain of being, what it did, it starts with the smaller organisms, and from the smaller organisms it will go on and on and on to the larger organisms. It will end with the human being. Because human being is the organism at the top of, actually not human being. As I said earlier, it is a white male. It will end with a white male. The white male will be at the top of the pyramid. But what Darwin did was he demolished this. This is the real problem with Darwin. Why the West even today is not able to accept Darwinian evolution is this. Because he changed that to a tree. You can see here that the life forms evolve like branching out from a particular tree. So he said also that there is only one living spirit which actually manifests itself differently. And this created the problem for the West. Had Darwin said that we are evolving gradually from small living of small organisms to higher organisms, and at the end there is human being, there would not have been any problem. They would have accepted Darwin. In fact, that is what Lamarck said. And Lamarck never created any problem for the Western civilization. Because Darwin said all life is one. And because Darwin said it is a tree with branches, that they found it very hard to digest. But in the case of Indian system, Indian civilization, it is very, very interesting again, because in 1859, Darwin publishes his Origin of Species. And then the entire West is taken by storm. They are debating and debating. And I will suggest to you a really nice movie, Inherit the Wind. It is about something called Scopes Monkey Trail. In the United States, even in the 20th century, there were states where teaching evolution could land you in jail. So that much of resistance they had for evolution. Now, in India, it was very easily accepted. Have you ever seen any Indian school, any Indian so-called fundamentalist saying that you should not teach Darwin in schools? Have you ever heard of it? India is supposed to be a land of ignorant people, unscientific people. Yet, Indian culture is able to accept Darwinian evolution so naturally, unlike any other civilization. So can we go to the next slide? So it is here the importance of Jagadish Chandra Bose comes. If you ask anyone what Jagadish Chandra Bose did, the answer is that he found out that plants had these feelings like humans. It is one of the worst misinterpretation of Jagadish Chandra Bose. What Jagadish Chandra Bose discovered was that plants have electrical activity to stimulus, just like we have. Our nervous system has. Our nervous system has electrical activity. Plants don't have nervous system, but plants also exhibit electrical activity in response to the stimulus. He was not talking about feelings. He was not talking about emotions of plants. He was not talking about anything like that. He was just telling plants also have a similar electromagnetic system inside them that can respond to the external stimuli. And then he said, this connects the plants with the animals, and it connects the so-called living with the non-living, and it is hard to draw any boundary line between the plants and animals. Now, at that time, there was high resistance to what J.C. Bose said. But J.C. Bose was able to derive this from two factors. One is from Darwin, and the one was from Vedanta. In his lecture at the Royal Society, he in fact quoted Vedanta. It was Darwin who first suggested that plants may be having some kind of a neuromechanism similar to the brain. He said that the roots of the brain, it is a very interesting thing, because Darwin proposed that the roots of the brain should be acting as, roots of the plants should be acting as their brain. It is called the root brain theory. So the roots, they send out chemicals through the soil to the other roots, and they all form a sort of a nervous system. If you have seen the film Avatar, you would have seen a dramatic replay of this particular theory in that movie. But Darwin said this. And later, Jagadish Chandra Bose found out that there is electrical activity in all the plants. He took Mimosa pudica, which is the touch me not plant, and he studied them, and then he found that this electrical activity is there in all the plants. And this is a very important discovery. At that time, the science was not ready. The Western science was not ready to accept his theories, and he was relegated to a corner. Today, if you go to the Google and if you just type plant neurobiology, just type plant neurobiology in Google, you will have lots of papers. In almost all the papers, you will see J.C. Bose being referred to as the pioneer in this field. So how Jagadish Chandra Bose was able to be so far ahead of his time, it was because he has integrated the Indic idea of all life being one. Go to the next slide. So in evolution, if you see evolution and take religious figures who talked about evolution, the only persons of their time who talked of talked in a way to accept evolution and even suggest a certain important modification to the present theory of evolution are two, Sri Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda. They both said, yes, evolution is true. And they had this idea of Satkaryavada. So Swami Vivekananda went a step forward and he said, every evolution presupposes an involution. So every evolution presupposes an involution. If you have, for example, a DNA strand, the DNA strand should have the capacity to create all this diversity. So where was all this diversity? All this diversity were already involuted in the DNA. As the situations changed, as the circumstances changed, as the environment changed, these particular aspects that are already present, these potentialities that are already present inside that particular DNA started getting manifested. This is again something that is derived from Satkaryavada. And Sri Aurobindo says something very interesting. He says that evolution happens gradually, yes, but there are certain accumulated jumps in evolution. This is a very interesting thing. He says there are some accumulated jumps. The changes there is some kind of a saltation. The changes go on getting gathered again and again, and then suddenly the organism makes an evolutionary jump. He says this in 1915. In 1980s, Stephen Jay Gould was talking about punctuated equilibrium in evolution. Evolution just does not happen just like that. Evolution does not happen just like in a linear way, but it also makes jumps. Today we have very strong evidences for that in the form of Cambrian explosion and everything. But again, the interesting thing is, both Sri Aurobindo and Vivekananda, I would say, did not know about punctuated equilibrium. But they were able to see it in a broader sense, in a broader philosophical sense. They were able to again frame the frameworks through which you can reach there. Unfortunately, the Indian educational system was not ready for that. Indian science education was not ready for that. We are not able to visualize a system where we can integrate both. We are always looking at the West and we are mapping their thoughts. It is high time we integrate these things, then we will be able to do wonders in the field of science. We go to the next slide. And then there is Kropotkin. He said, the Russian anarchist. So he was very uncomfortable with the Darwin's survival of the fittest. Actually, it was not, the phrase was not that of Darwin, it was Herbert Spencer. So Spencer was saying like, the survival of the fittest in the realm of biological evolution justifies the exploitation of the weak, the colonization of Asian countries by Europe and everything. When he was saying these things, Swami Vivekananda and others, Kropotkin actually wrote a book. He said, it is mutual cooperation that is the basis of evolution. Swami Vivekananda took it forward. He also said that, according to Patanjali, the evolution that happens in the human level is something that is qualitatively different from the evolution that was happening in the pre-human level. And you see the third figure, his name is Vernadsky. He is a Russian pioneer in geobiochemistry. That is, he considered that the entire geology is also influenced by biological process. And he said, first there is the geosphere, then you have the biosphere, then third, he said, you have noosphere. Noosphere is the earth that is connected by thoughts. Almost a kind of a premonition of internet. Earth that is connected by thoughts. Then there were two scientists. One person is called John Lovelock, and the one is Lynn Margulis. Lynn Margulis was a microbiologist. She was studying small cells. She found out that we have mitochondria, and within mitochondria you have circular DNA. You have chloroplast within plants, and the chloroplast also has circular DNA. And circular DNA is always present in prokaryotes, that is organisms like bacteria. So she said, what has happened in ancient times is that these small organisms, they created a symbiosis with the living cells. They entered into the living cell. The living cell gave them some sort of a living place, and in return, these small organisms, they started giving them energy in the case of mitochondria, or giving them food in the case of chloroplast. So she said that this is the basis of evolution. The most important basis of evolution is not competition, but this kind of a cooperation. And this is a very interesting thing. She called it endosymbiosis or symbiogenesis. She said this is the basis of evolution. Meanwhile, James Lovelock was a physicist. He was working with NASA. He had to study Mars, the spectroscopic study of Mars, to determine whether there is life. And he discovered that the atmospheric pattern of Mars and atmospheric pattern of Earth are so radically different that Earth looked like a living organism. So he said, seems the entire Earth looks like a big mega living system. He didn't say living organism, he said a big mega living system. Then Lynn Margulis was at the same time saying, every single organism is actually a collection of many organisms. So here is one person who is saying the entire Earth is a collection of the entire Earth is one organism and we are all small organelles inside that big organism. Here is Lynn Margulis saying every organism is actually a collection of many organisms. And they came together, they created this theory called Gaia. Gaia is the name of ancient mother goddess in Greek mythology. So Earth has life. That is what they came to conclusion. Swami Vivekananda says this, interestingly. He says, even the smallest worm in the earth balances the entire earth. So if you take a earthworm, it also has an ecological significance for the entire earth. So all living organisms are connected together. How Vivekananda is able to come to this particular conclusion? Years, decades before Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock. So all this make us, and very interestingly, when James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis put forward their theory, they couldn't find a single science journal to publish it. They were opposed to it. They were saying, what is this? This is nonsense. This is some kind of mythology. This is some kind of new age cult. We cannot allow this. There was terrible resistance. There is one theologian of science, Michael Hughes, and he says the resistance to this Gaia theory came because the entire science establishment was sort of Abrahamic in nature. So they saw this as a kind of a pagan goddess invading the entire establishment. See how the basic epistemological prejudices can play even in established science. We may think that it is all objective, but deep inside there are prejudices, there are bias, and they can determine the way the science takes, the course the science takes is determined by these aspects. That is why we need, again and again I am saying, that is why we need very urgently a curriculum that combines the darshanas, the Indic knowledge systems on one hand, and the greater questions of science on the other. It will help the people not only to create exploration of science but also appreciate science. How do we appreciate science? To see the entire universe as a dance of Shiva is an appreciation of science. It can allow you to appreciate each and every new scientific discovery very easily, to accommodate itself with you, and you can create beautiful art. You can create beautiful music, paintings based on the new insights of science integrated with Indic knowledge systems. So this is one advantage that we have. No other country has. All countries throughout the world, the individuals are struggling. The great Albert Einstein said once, when the quantum mechanics was coming up, you should remember that Albert Einstein was a great mathematician, a brilliant physicist, but he was deep inside, he was a Jew. So he has to have objective laws, objective universe. And here is quantum mechanics coming up. And quantum mechanics says there is no such thing as an objective universe. In everything, consciousness has a play, and that Einstein was not able to accept that. He said, I feel like the ground is moving away under my feet. It is the ground of the philosophy of objective universe was moving away from this. He said, I don't think God plays dice with the universe. Niels Bohr was very much irritated that he said, Dr. Einstein, please for one time stop telling God what he has to do. And another one interesting point is that Werner Heisenberg, who was one of the formulators of quantum theory, when he formulated the theory, he was not able to publish it because the kind of reality that particular theory that he himself has mathematically formulated was actually crazy. And he felt very depressing. If this comes out, what happens to everything that we have built in the name of science, and he was very much depressed. Then he took a vacation. He came to Shantiniketan. He was a friend of Rabindranath Tagore. He came to Shantiniketan. He has given this in an interview to Fritjof Capra. It is in a book called Uncommon Wisdom. He says, Werner Heisenberg says, then he comes to India, he looks at the culture. So here is a culture. The entire culture is based on the notion that there is no objective reality, that the realities are something that we co-create. And this gives him the confidence that he goes back and he publishes the quantum mechanics paper. So, these aspects are there at each and every point in the development of particularly the modern science. The importance of philosophical systems will become very, very vital. And this gives Indian curriculum framers a very great opportunity, unique in the world. Just think of the 6 darshanas. 3 of them are Satkaryavada, then there is Asatkaryavada. And you have Saptabanki in Jain philosophy. You have dependent causation in Buddhism. And if you study the entire history of co-evolution, if you study the science of co-evolution, you will find it as an echo of the dependent causation said by Nagarjuna. So just you have possibilities. The only thing is, the treasure is before us. Are we going to say that, yeah, we got the treasure, our ancestors are really great, our ancestors found all these treasures? Are we going to say this again and again and again and keep the treasure and beg to everyone for food? Or are we going to utilize this in a creative way, in a way no one else has utilized so far? That is why Sri Aurobindo said, I will finish this with this particular statement of Sri Aurobindo. He said, we do not belong to the dawns of the past. We belong to the noons of the future. So now we have to sculpt the noons of our future. And we have the tools in our hand. How we are going to use it is to us. So this is essentially a request to the students and the academicians here to integrate this together and create a great India. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. With eminent and wise men like you on the stage, the audience would always crave for interaction. May we now invite the audience for a short question and answer session with Arvindan sir. Those who wish to participate may stand up and raise their hands one by one.
Namaskar Arvindji, I am Kavin. My question is, see, you know about the Indic Valley system and you studied it through many different ways, but we don't know how to approach it. You have reached, you know that what is the goal is and how to accumulate it, but we here are like in the mundane state. So there is this knowledge which is there, but there are we where we are very low, but we don't know how to travel the path. Means you have traveled the path, you know how to reach, how to study this Indic knowledge and where to find it. So can you, it's always like the yojaka tatra durlabha, means the connector is not there. So how do we become that connector of going from the mundane state to knowing this Indian state? Can you define it from your way, how you from childhood, how one you travel this path and how did you come to know about all these Shat Darshanas and all? I don't know where to go, how to find, where to find.
Yeah. If I would just skip the personal part and I would go to this generally. If a student, any student who is very inquisitive, who is growing in this environment, the first thing that he learns is that if he is very inquisitive, let us say, when he becomes a teenager, he is given tools to study whatever has been taught in his childhood. Okay. So in the house, he is given a lot of, worshipping the Tulsi plant, or it is daily singing some hymns and stuff like that. Then when he is a teenager, he is given tools like Marxism, for example, and told that you can understand your basic culture and all the products of your culture through these tools. Either it is colonialism, or it is Marxism, or it is feminism, or it is subaltern studies, whatever. So what happened is a state of rebellion comes, and automatically at that time when you are a teenager, your hormonal cycle is such that it is really lovely to be a rebel. So you become a rebel and you say that, yeah, this is all nonsense. It is just the feudal, patriarchal, Brahminical structures that are created to control people. That is all the jargons that has been fed to us. And we think that we have actually, by categorizing a thing like that, by categorizing a thing, we have actually understood that thing. That is something that the West has taught us. You know, when Adam was sent into the Garden of Eden by God, what he did was he named everything. And when he named everything, he automatically understood everything. So that is what the Western way of understanding has been doing since then. What they have been doing is that if you classify it, if you categorize it, and if you can put it in a pigeonhole to one's own satisfaction, then we have just described it. So those kind of systems have been given to us, and we have been told to study our religion through those systems. Okay, that is what we are in. But then this creates actually a clash. If you look very deeply, this creates a clash. Either we become schizophrenics or we become hypocrites. We follow our religion, we follow our culture in our house, and outside we come and we will become rational beings. We can hold our hands in veneration before a cow dung piece, telling that it is Pillayar in the house, right? And then when we come out, we tell that this is all nonsense. I do it just for the sake of ritual, so that the elders will not get offended in our house. But I don't believe in all those kind. Though I am a Hindu, I don't believe in all those. That is actually the line that we use. Of course, I am not using the word Hindu here in any communal sense. I am telling in general. Though I am an Indian, I don't believe in. You can fill it up with anything you want. Okay, in our culture. So that is the kind of mindset that we have come to. Now, how to break from this? One is start going deep into your own culture. Don't tell where I can find it. You can find your culture around you, everywhere. Everywhere you can find it. From an ordinary beggar who tells that do some punya. He is asking you to do some punya. And just start thinking, what is the English word, what is the English equivalent word for punya? I am not going to the concept of dharma, I am just coming to the concept of punya. So what is the English equivalent word? No word. But at the same time, for papa there is an English equivalent word, sin. For punya there is no English equivalent word, why? And what is the use of this punya? You have, I was in Vivekananda Kendra. So Vivekananda Kendra has a project called Natural Resource Development Project. We were working on the temple tanks, the water bodies, traditional water bodies in Rameshwaram. Rameshwaram, as you know, is a very small island among the sea. Right? It's a small island. And there are more than 60 water bodies, traditional water bodies created by our ancestors in that small island. And today, till the last 100 years, all these water bodies were functioning. But today, there are barely 20 of the water bodies. When we started recovering these water bodies, we were also recovering inscriptions, and we were also finding about these water bodies in our traditional mythologies. Mind you, I am not talking about scholarly philosophical works, mythologies. And in all this, there is one consistent thing. It says, if you preserve these water bodies, you and your posterity will get punya. That is the common refrain in all these water bodies, whether it is inscriptions or whether it is mythologies. So, what has happened is, for more than 2000 years, by this simple concept of punya, they were able to do wonderful water harvesting and management system in an arid island. In all the water bodies we recovered, we were able to get fresh water. Around us, the saline sea water, but in every water body we recovered, which have been defunct for now 100 years, we were able to get fresh water, which means they have been working as water harvesting structures for millennia. And behind this, the social engineering aspect, that is the modern phrase, right? The social engineering aspect is punya. But it is not just a social engineering aspect, right? So if you look at things around you, go into it, contemplate over it, then you will be able to understand that this is a very big system, a big web of interrelationships that have been created through very beautiful, subtle philosophical nuances. From that thread, if you catch a particular thread and you walk through the thread, you will be able to arrive at some of the grandest basic principles that govern the universe and human psyche. So that is how when person comes to these things at another level. When we were having the presentation, one of the person was you were telling about the moral values being lost, the history being lost to our own people. In fact, when I was interacting with him, the idea this came to me, and Amar Chitra Kada. Amar Chitra Kada has given us all the history that has been neglected, ignored, either intentionally or in an ignorant way by the state. So, if a person from South India knows about, let us say, Khudiram Bose, then most probably that person should have read Amar Chitra Kada. If a person from North India knows about Kannagi, most probably that person has read Amar Chitra Kada. Now, Amar Chitra Kada is one example where the knowledge that is contained in our culture and history has been brought in such lucid forms and given to children. Become aware of all these efforts and take it to the children, take it to the next generation. And in the case of philosophy, you have to do is read. I will suggest right now, there is no other go. There are only Western popular science writers. Just recently, the book has come called Indica. It's a very interesting heading, Indica, a Greek name for India. It is about the deep natural history of India, written by Pranay Lal. It's a very beautiful book. You can go through that, then you will be able to understand the magnificence of things that have formed this, right? So the popular science books like that of Carl Sagan or V.S. Ramachandran, they make you understand the grandeur of life and how naturally they give you the sense of the divine and the cosmic, what Einstein called the cosmic religious feeling. It is through that right now you can move into the Indian philosophy. Even our daily hymns that you hear about, like for example Lalita Sahasranama, or the Tamil hymns that we have traditionally like Thiruvasakam, Devaram. So all these are available everywhere, and in each of them, each word is pregnant with such deep meanings. All you have to do is get a commentary. It is very cheap, it is very cost effective, you can get and you can read it, but the results that you will get are not cheap. That will be with you for all your life and it will guide you. Okay?
And finally, the much awaited moment has arrived. It is now time to announce the winners for 4 Minutes for India. Ayudh invites Dr. Rameshwar Shivadas to announce the second runner-up. So please go onto the stage.
As a part of judge team, we were privileged to interact with these youngsters who came up with wide variety of ideas. It was really give us goosebumps that the children are talking about environment, social issues, justice, entrepreneurship, and many more things. So here I am declaring the second runner-up. Please give a big hand to Mr. Sushil Kumar Patil, Shamika Ganeshan, and Pooja. Please come on the dais. They were one team.
We all know that there are three essential things required for a human being to live. They are roti, kabda and makan. One among them we need every day is roti, that is food. Do we really grow our food? No, obviously not. Since we all are busy in our day-to-day life, we certainly purchase vegetables, fruits and some cooked items from the supermarkets and mall. We all spend most of our salary amount to purchasing food items. Whenever we go to purchase vegetables and fruits, places like supermarket and mall, which are really posh and air conditioned, we never hesitate to pay whatever the prices are written on the price tag. But whenever we'll go to a local market to purchase the same vegetables and fruits, we'll bargain as least price as possible, isn't it? Yeah, you might be thinking why this guy is telling me about my routine in this video, but there is really something wrong.
When the farmer produces the vegetables and the fruits, their product is brought by the local wholesaler, who sells the same with some profit to the retailers, who again in turn adds his own profit to it and sells to the buyers. That is us. Now just imagine how much extra money we are paying to buy the same which the producer itself sold for the less price. We can put it in this way also. The man who produces our roti, when he goes to the local retailers to buy those goods, since he paid the least in this money transaction chain, he does not have sufficient money to cope up with the retailer's price that he wants to purchase. You think only the farmer is facing it alone? Of course not. If we produce less, India has to import more. Then the cost of the roti will increase. Now think, doesn't it affect you?
All we have to do is come up with a way to remove the middlemen who are involved in this transaction. For this purpose, we have come up with an idea of an Android app. This app will be connecting farmers with buyers in cities. The farmers will quote their prices for their produce, and the customers in the nearby cities will choose their supplier and order vegetables through the app by evening on the previous day. Next morning, they get the vegetables and fruits that they had ordered for at their doorstep, and the payment will be done through the app. Now, the main challenge here is how do we manage the transportation? For this, majorly two things come into picture. First, transportation will have to be taken care by the local villagers itself. No third party should be involved. By doing this, job opportunities in villages will also be increased. Second, the app should have a GPS system which restricts the customers to order vegetables and fruits from villages which are within 15-kilometer radius so that it is feasible for the farmers to transport goods every day.
Well, this is just an outline of the plan that we have in mind. We have spoken to some of the farmers in Karnataka who are willing to join in. We need to speak to people in the nearby cities for a trial. And of course, we will be needing initial funding as well. If this works out, we can surely help farmers live a better life. After all, they are the ones who feed us.
We all know that there are three essential things required.
Now I again inviting Sri Arvinda Neelakantan sir to present the award.
Om Amarteshwari Nama. What you have seen was the 4 minutes presentation of the second runner-up. And the first runner-up is Madhumita.
And finally, the wait is over. We request Brahmachari Amit, Chief Coordinator, Ayuth India.
And I heard about 4 Minutes for India. I was literally lost in a maze of problems and progress. I didn't know what to speak about when a heap of problems were piling in front of me. I became very hysterical. I am young. I am as young as 14. Should I feel so disheartened about my own country? I think I should. We need to wake up in our mother's womb itself. With a very rich history, we enamored the British to loot ourselves for over 200 years. We strived, we craved to get rid of them. Why? Because we wanted to be independent. We gained freedom over 70 years ago. And even now we celebrate it with so much joy. Now tell me, where is the independence when Russia sells us weapons, Germany sells us cars, and US sells us gadgets? Are we realizing our position? We are very dependent. What shall we do? Well, yeah, make in India. Buying products, buying parts from other countries, assembling it over here and selling it, labeling made in India. Is it making in India? As I obsess my thoughts with this dependency of our country, I find another great hindrance clogging our progress. Our attraction, our attachment and our attitude towards foreign products. See, I have 2 products in my hand. One is imported and one is of local quality. One is locally manufactured. Which one will we choose? Of course, most of us opt for these imported ones. Why? Because imported ones are of high quality. Wouldn't India manufacture high quality goods in standard commodities? The solution for all such worries, which I figured out, was youth entrepreneurship. When many youth decide to take up entrepreneurship, most of the economic problems will be solved. Entrepreneurship in the sense, I don't mean business alone. Possessing one's own clinic, employing workers on a field, one's own field is also entrepreneurship. We are being recruited by the foreigners because we are skilled. Why don't we use that skill to establish our own monopoly? With the growth of entrepreneurship, we are able to create very wide job opportunities. We can come up with very wide-ranging ideas. See, we are facing so much environmental issues that could be solved by manufacturing some eco-friendly products, like the ones in Hyderabad who manufactured cutleries out of millet. That was very innovative. We could come up with such ideas. Such ideas will result in very great progress. We will be able to find solutions for the environmental issues. We will be able to serve the nation and the nature. We will be able to earn, increase employment, increase per capita, annual export, and what not. So much things could happen. We people being young, we are innovative, modernized and enthusiastic. We could attract as much customers as possible. And when entrepreneurs persist in our country, we will be able to see self-sufficient, efficient, esteemed and independent youths all around the nation. My request to the government is to encourage and instigate people with more policies and being tax friendly. So now I conclude saying that when entrepreneurship persists, we will also be able to prove that Indian products can also be of best quality. Jai.
And finally, we request Brahmachari Amit, Chief Coordinator, Ayuth India, to announce the winner of 4 Minutes for India.
Very happy to see the energy and the enthusiasm of the participants. Anyway, as I told you, all of you are winners, but for formality's sake, the winner of this contest is, you have already seen the name, I guess, Mr. Akash G. Please
And
come
I
on the stage.
request Sri Aravinda Neelakantan sir to present the award. Ayod invites the other finalists.
Mark, I invite you to put up my ideas on how to transform this nation. My dear friends, I am able to identify one and only reason for the backfall of this nation, that is casteism. Casteism only acts as the barricade for the development and transformation of this nation. But my dear friends, reservations are a means which were thought to uproot casteism from this nation. But the reality is that reservations are deeply rooting casteism into our country. Every citizen of this nation is to be treated equally according to the Article 14 and 15 from the Constitution of India. But is it happening in our country right now? Are every student treated equally? Are every student getting equal opportunities to get into institutions? Never. Why? Because of reservations on basis of caste. There is a good motto behind it. Every backward class has to come up in life. India has to develop uniformly. Everything is alright. But do you think every FC is going to be very rich and every SC or ST is going to be very poor or economically backward? It is a full stop, my dear friends. Reservations can be given, but not on the basis of caste, but on the basis of economic status. Economic status is not a mere thing which can be determined with your caste. Caste is just the means of your birth, but not your economic status. Not every FC student can secure proper cutoff marks to get into institutions, nor does every SC student get low cutoff. There are SC students who get 199 cutoff and there are FC students who get 160 cutoff. Knowledge cannot be determined with caste, my dear friends. Then why give reservations for getting into institutions or government jobs based on castes? Casteism is the greatest threat to our nation, but reservations is a greater threat than casteism. An FC student who's trying to get into a medicinal field thinks that, oh my god, I don't have reservations, why I try medicine, then I won't get seats, all the reservations, all the percentages taken away, then I get a very small proportion. Do I have the proper potential to get into it? Should I go to medicine? And though he has a proper passion towards medicine, he is not able to get into it because of caste-based reservations. Take off a person who is getting benefited of reservation. Oh, I have reservations. Then why give my fullest potential? Why express my talent? And the talent is hidden just because of this caste-based reservation. Caste-based reservation was appropriate at once, but the time is past. It is history right now. There was once a time where caste was treated as a basis of economical status. Are we still Brahmanas and Kshatriyas? We are Indians, not a base of caste. I want to register in this place that an IAS aspirant, if he's going to write in a general quota, he gets only 6 chances and can write only up to 32 years. But an OBC student can write 9 times and has 37 years. But an SC and SC student has unlimited chances. My God, what a casteism is this? Indian government has become a totally racist. Why? I would like to register in this competition that reservations are a basis for an unified development, but not for casteism. Thank you.
We invite Sri Arvindan Neelakantan sir once again to give his message to the contestants of 4 Minutes of India.
Actually, we have a clarification here. The prizes are given not because we accepted whatever the participants have been saying, but because the genuine way in which it was presented, the case was presented. In fact, when we had interaction with the winner of this team, of this event, we told him that, in fact, we are for reservations. We support reservations. We do not accept his concept of economics-based reservations and things like that, because we understand, we have seen another reality where the caste-based discriminations are so rampant and so tyrannical that we do need reservations. There is no question about that. It is another form of justice. So why it has been given, why the prize has been given, we want to make it very clear. If we are going to judge all the three presentations which we have chosen purely in terms of, in absolute terms, then the presentation that came third should have been given the first prize. It was very wonderful. They have done a exhaustive study of technological feasibility, and if it clicks, it will actually transform India like wildfire for better. So actually we should have given to the third presentation. But there were other considerations. One was that the age of the participants. Then the participants, there were three, it was a team effort. And in the case of these two students, they were both 14 years. They were both extremely honest. They were so passionate. And why we gave the first prize is because he has done homework. Whether you accept him or not is another matter. He has gone through the constitution. He was quoting the articles. And when we were interacting with him, he was able to give us data. He has done a survey in his own classroom. And of course, that sample is a very screwed up sample. Actually, he should have done, as our Dr. Ram Ture pointed out, he should have done the same sampling in government schools, not in his own school. Then he would have come out with another. But for a 14-year-old boy to feel like this, for the nation, from his heart, and talk honestly and fearlessly, for a girl to think about green technologies, think about green technological entrepreneurship. A 14-year-old girl, and she didn't even say that in the program, in the video. When we were interacting, she was coming up with that very spontaneously. We were not even prodding her. Very spontaneously she was coming up with that. So taking all that into consideration, we have given these awards. But each one of the participants, all the 10 participants, they taught us, all the 3 judges, they gave us inputs, they taught us very valuable lessons. So to each one of you, we are indebted. And some of the persons, for example, the one who talked about the moral values. Then one person was talking about how to generate energy from a windmill connected to the car. Then there is another one person who has very vividly thought about battery, pedal operated battery, and an application to have those bicycles and bikes by everyone, everywhere. So each one of these ideas were very beautiful, very wonderful. As they are in the seed forms, and we really had a tough time choosing the winners. And these 3 winners, I congratulate each one of them, and I congratulate all the 10 participants for what they have given us. Thank you very much.
Ayodh invites the other finalists of 4 Minutes for India, Gautam S. Kumar, Vinayak S. Kumar, Rahul Nair and Yadu Krishna V, to come onto the stage and receive certificates from Arvindan Nilakantan sir. Now we invite Shri Vinod Kumar sir to give the vote of thanks.
Om Amriteshwari Namaha. Honorable Chief Guest, Sri Aravindan Nilakanthan, and all the dignitaries here, my brothers and sisters. It was indeed a wonderful evening, afternoon plus evening. We enjoyed it. At the outset, let me express my deep appreciation for the wonderful talk our chief guest has delivered here. It actually burned the concept or the misunderstanding of our youngsters that modernization is westernization. Somehow, somewhere, our youngsters have been thinking that if I have to be modern, I have to be western looking. So he actually gave a wonderful enlightening lecture. I remember the last sloka of Narayaniyam, one of the greatest scholars of Kerala, Melpattur Narayana Bhattacharya. He has written 1,000 slokas in Narayaniyam for his cure of some ailments. And the last sloka starts with Ajñatva te mahatvam. I don't know your greatness. Even now I am ignorant. After writing all this Vedantic and everything, finally he concludes it saying that still I am ignorant. So after listening to him, we were feeling that we are yet to know about our mother. Our mother who has been feeding us and who will be feeding, we don't know the greatness of our mother. So thank you, sir, for that wonderful lecture. On behalf of Ayudh India, Ayudh chapter Amritapuri and all the Amrita fraternity, I express our gratitude for coming over here. He accepted our invitation and his gracious presence here. He delivered a wonderful lecture. We thank you, sir, on behalf of all of us. Next, the judges who put a lot of effort from morning onwards, Dr. Prakash Shankar and Dr. Rameshwar Shivadas. I thank both of them on behalf of Ayudh as well as on behalf of all other participants. When we discuss the whole event, 4 minutes for India, all these participants and others who have already sent their nominations or their programs, all of them deserve a great thanks from our side, because through them we were able to perform or conduct such a wonderful program. So I profusely thank each one of you, and I'm sure that the preparation that you have done for this 4 minutes will be maybe much more than 4,000 minutes you must have spent. And I'm sure that this effort and the thoughts you have already done on this presentation and these ideas will remain ever in you in such a way that you will become valuable citizens of our motherland. I'm sure about that. Next, I would like to thank the ICTS team who has helped us in providing the audiovisual system, sound system, and the GAD team here who helped us in arranging these events. Also the electrical team. Above all, I would like to thank, I don't even want to put not but the least, I don't like that. Above all, I am putting it. The Ayudh members, the Ayudh chapter Amritapuri, who work relentlessly with this idea. It's a wonderful idea. And I equate, we all chant in Amma's Ashtotaram, Veda Shastra Purane Itihasa Shashwata Bandhave Namaha. We appreciate or we chant Amma's mantra saying that Amma is in constant connection, constant communion with Veda Shastra Purana Itihasa. All these are part of our Sanatan Dharma. So Amma is the embodiment of Dharma, and such dharmic activities that we do is actually our archanas to Amma. And you can be proud of offering yet another flower at the lotus feet of our Amma by conducting and doing such a wonderful event. So I congratulate and I thank all the Ayudhyans here. I also thank our director Sudeep ji for providing facilities here, and all the heads of the departments of various institutions and the departments for supporting the Ayudh team to conduct such an event. So thank you one and all once again. Om Amriteshwari Namaha.
Now we invite Brahmachari Amit ji once again to honor our chief guest with Ponnada and present to him our special memento, crafted at our own Amrita Shilpakala Kshetra as a token of our heartfelt gratitude.